The ink stain on Sarah Reeves's hand looked like a tiny mountain range, which seemed fitting given that she was about to map the most treacherous peaks in Nevada territory. It was the spring of 1872, and Piotr was bursting at the seams with silver miners, gamblers, and men who did not take kindly to a woman telling them where the rivers ran, or how the valleys cut through the land. But Sarah had proven herself time and again, her maps more accurate than any surveyor the government had sent west, and now she had a contract that would either make her reputation or break her entirely. She stood in the cramped office above the general store, rolling up her latest commission while the morning sun streamed through the single dusty window. The map showed the route between Piotr and the mines at Bullionville, every gulch and wash marked with her precise hand. Outside, the sounds of the boomtown filtered up through the floorboards, horses neighing, men shouting, the constant hammering from new construction. Piotr had grown from nothing to nearly 6,000 souls in just a few years, all chasing silver in the ground. "Miss Reeves, you cannot be serious about this expedition." Sarah turned to face Thomas Whitmore, the Surveyor General's assistant who had brought her the new assignment. He was a slight man with a perpetually worried expression, and right now he looked like he might faint. "I am entirely serious, Mr. Whitmore. The contract is signed. I leave in 3 days. But the high country alone for months. I will not be alone. I am hiring a guide." Sarah tucked the rolled map into its leather case with practiced efficiency. "Someone who knows the terrain." Whitmore wrung his hands. "If you insist on this folly, at least take Matthew Garrett. He came in from the Ruby Mountains last week, knows the territory better than any man alive." The Mountain Man. Sarah had heard stories about Matthew Garrett. Everyone in Piotr had. He was something of a legend, a man who preferred the company of bears and eagles to civilization, who only came down from the high peaks when he needed supplies he could not trap or make himself. "I heard he does not work with people." "He does not. But for you, perhaps he might make an exception." "Your father saved his life once, did he not?" Sarah's chest tightened at the mention of her father. Daniel Reeves had been the finest cartographer in the West until consumption had taken him 2 years ago, leaving Sarah with his tools, his knowledge, and a burning need to finish what he had started. That was 5 years ago when Garrett had taken a bullet in a dispute over trapping rights. Father pulled him through the fever. "Then he owes you. The debt would pass to family." She had her doubts about that, but the truth was that she needed someone who knew the unnamed peaks and hidden valleys she had been contracted to map. The survey stretched from the high Ruby Mountains down through the uncharted regions where few white men had ventured, and even fewer had returned. It was dangerous work, but the government was finally serious about accurate maps of Nevada territory, and Sarah Reeves was going to deliver them. "Where can I find him?" "Try the Silver Spur. He is staying at the boarding house 2 doors down, but he takes his evening meal at the saloon." That evening, Sarah walked into the Silver Spur with her head high and her proposal tucked in her satchel. The room went quiet in that particular way it always did when she entered a male space uninvited. She was used to it. At 22, she had learned to navigate a world that did not want her in it, armed with nothing but competence and stubbornness. The bartender, a grizzled man named Jack, nodded toward the back corner. "If you are looking for Garrett, he is over there, but I would think twice, Miss Reeves." Sarah did not think twice. She walked straight to the corner table where a man sat alone, his back to the wall in the way of someone who had learned caution through hard experience. Matthew Garrett was bigger than she had imagined. His shoulders were broad enough to block out the wall behind him, muscles evident even beneath the worn buckskin shirt he wore. Dark hair fell past his collar, not quite long enough to tie back, and his hands wrapped around a tin cup looked like they could crush stone. Everything about him spoke of raw strength and a life lived in places where weakness meant death. "Mr. Garrett," he looked up, and Sarah was struck by the intensity of his gaze. His eyes were a startling blue-gray, like storm clouds over the mountains, and they studied her with an intelligence that seemed at odds with his rough appearance. "You are Daniel Reeves's daughter." His voice was deep, roughened by years of shouting over wind and talking to himself in the wilderness. "You have his eyes. Sarah Reeves, I have a proposition for you. Not interested." He returned his attention to his cup. Sarah pulled out the chair across from him and sat, ignoring the shocked murmur from the other patrons. "You have not heard it yet. Don't need to. I don't work with people anymore, and I especially don't guide foolish women into country that will kill them. The high peaks and the eastern valleys. 6 months, maybe less if we move fast. Government contract, full survey, I will pay you $300. That got his attention. His eyes flicked back to her, reassessing. 300, and supplies. Everything we need I will provide. You cannot afford me at 3,000, Miss Reeves, because I don't want your money. I want to be left alone. But there was something in his voice, a hint of curiosity perhaps, that made Sarah press forward. My father spoke of you often. He said you were the finest tracker he had ever seen, that you could read land the way he read maps. He said you understood the mountains in a way that no map could capture. Matthew's jaw tightened. Your father was a good man. That does not mean I am going to lead his daughter into the wilderness to die. I am not going to die. I have been mapping since I was 14. I know how to survive. In town, with a roof over your head and stores nearby. He leaned forward, and Sarah caught the scent of pine and wood smoke that clung to him. Where you want to go, there are no second chances. One mistake and the land takes you. I have seen it happen to men twice your size with 10 times your experience. Then teach me. The words came out more pleading than she intended, and she hated the way her voice wavered. I have to do this. This contract, these maps, they are everything. My father spent his life trying to chart the West accurately. I am going to finish his work with or without you. But I would rather it be with you, because I want to live long enough to see these maps completed. For a long moment, Matthew said nothing. He studied her face as if he could read her determination in the set of her jaw, the steadiness of her gaze despite her nerves. Finally, he sighed, a sound like wind through canyon walls. You leave in 3 days. Yes, make it a week. I need time to scout the route, plan provisions. And we do this my way, understand? In the wilderness, my word is law. You do exactly as I say when I say it, no questions. Relief flooded through Sarah so quickly she felt dizzy. Agreed. And the money is 400. If I am going to risk my neck keeping you alive, I want proper compensation. She should have negotiated, should have pointed out that he had just said money did not matter to him. But she was so grateful to have him agree that she simply nodded. 400. Half now, half when we return. They shook on it, and Sarah was acutely aware of how his hand engulfed hers, calloused and warm and strong. When she left the Silver Spur that night, the eyes of every man in the place followed her, but all she could think about was the journey ahead, and the mountain man who would guide her into lands no map had ever captured. The next week passed in a blur of preparation. Sarah spent her days organizing supplies, checking and rechecking her instruments, and going over every map her father had made of the region. The evenings, Matthew spent teaching her what he called the basics of not dying stupidly. This involved lessons on reading weather signs, identifying edible plants, and understanding how to move through rough country without breaking an ankle or sliding off a cliff. You walk like a city girl, he said on the 3rd evening, watching her navigate a rocky slope outside town. All your weight forward, no balance. You do that on a mountain trail and you will pitch right over the edge. Sarah gritted her teeth and tried again, this time keeping her weight centered as he had shown her. It felt unnatural, but she forced herself to trust his instruction. When she made it back down without stumbling, she caught something that might have been approval in his expression. Better. You learn quick, at least. I had a good teacher. My father believed in thorough education. Book learning is different from staying alive. Matthew handed her a canteen. Drink. You are not drinking enough water. That is another mistake people make. As the week progressed, Sarah found herself watching Matthew with a cartographer's eye for detail. She noticed how he moved with an economy of motion that spoke of absolute confidence in his body. How he seemed to take up space without trying, his presence filling whatever area he occupied. How other men in Piach gave him a wide berth, respect mixed with a healthy dose of wariness. He was not a man to cross, that much was obvious. But when he spoke to her, there was a patience in his voice that suggested depth she had not expected. On the 7th day, they set out at dawn. Sarah rode a sturdy mare named Delilah, while Matthew rode a massive gray gelding that looked barely civilized. They led 2 pack mules loaded with supplies, surveying equipment, camping gear, food stores, ammunition, medical supplies, and all the paper and ink Sarah would need to create her maps. The weight of the commission sat heavy on her shoulders, but excitement bubbled up alongside the nerves. This was what she had trained for her entire life. They headed northeast from Piach, following old mining trails until those petered out, then tracking along routes only Matthew seemed to see. The Nevada landscape unfurled around them in shades of sage and stone, the high desert giving way gradually to pinon pine forests as they climbed. The spring air was crisp and clean, scented with juniper, and the last of the snow melting at higher elevations. For the first 2 days, they barely spoke except when necessary. Matthew would point out landmarks, warning her of loose rock or unstable ground. Sarah would take notes, sketching the terrain, marking elevations and water sources. At night, they made camp with practiced efficiency. Matthew would handle the fire and the animals, while Sarah prepared their evening meal from the supplies. They would eat in silence. Then Sarah would spend an hour transcribing her day's observations before exhaustion claimed her. On the 3rd night, as they camped beside a clear stream with the Ruby Mountains rising blue-black against the sunset, Matthew finally broke the pattern of silence. Your father taught you well. You have an eye for the land. Sarah looked up from her journal, surprised. Thank you. I learned everything from him. Why are you doing this? Matthew was cleaning his rifle, his hands moving with the sureness of long habit. A woman with your skills could make good money in San Francisco or Denver, working in an office, safe. Safe, Sarah repeated, tasting the word. My father used to say that safety was a cage dressed up as comfort. He believed maps were important, not just for navigation but for understanding. Every blank space on a map is a failure of knowledge. I want to fill those spaces. The spaces are blank for a reason. Some country does not want to be known, but it should be known. How else can we understand it, protect it, decide what matters? She set down her pen. Besides, what about you? You could live in town, hire out your tracking skills to merchants or the law. Why do you choose the mountains? Matthew was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, almost reluctant. Because mountains don't lie. They do not pretend to be something they are not. You know exactly where you stand with them. They will kill you if you are careless, but they will not betray you. There was a story there, Sarah sensed, something that had driven him away from the world of men. But she did not press. Instead, she said, then perhaps we are not so different. You seek truth in the wilderness. I seek to record it. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Sarah felt something shift in the air between them. It was not quite trust, not yet, but it was the beginning of understanding. The days fell into a rhythm as they pushed deeper into the high country. Matthew proved to be everything Thomas Whitmore had promised, and more. He knew the land with an intimacy that went beyond mere familiarity. He could read the slope of a hillside and predict where water would collect, study the flight of birds and know when weather was coming, examine tracks in the dirt, and tell stories about the animals that had passed hours or days before. Sarah filled pages and pages of her journals, but she began to realize that what she was learning could not be adequately captured in lines and measurements. Matthew showed her a valley where elk gathered in such numbers that the ground trembled with their passing. He led her to a hidden spring that flowed year-round, its water so pure and cold it made her teeth ache. He pointed out the subtle signs of an old trail used by indigenous peoples long before white settlers arrived, marks worn into stone that spoke of centuries of passage. "Your maps will not show this," he said one afternoon, standing on a ridge that overlooked a sweep of forested valley. "How the light falls here at sunset, turning everything gold. How the air smells different on this side of the mountain, sweeter somehow. How it feels to stand in a place where maybe 10 other people in all of history have stood." Sarah paused in her sketching. "No, maps cannot show that, but they can show where it is so that others can find it and feel what we feel now. And then it will not be secret anymore. It will be measured and marked and eventually owned. Knowledge does not have to lead to destruction, Matthew. Sometimes it leads to preservation, to appreciation. Maybe." But he did not sound convinced. As the weeks passed, Sarah found herself thinking about Matthew Garrett in ways that had nothing to do with his skills as a guide. She noticed how gentle he was with the animals, how he would spend extra time rubbing down the horses after a hard day's travel, how he always made sure she had the best spot in camp, sheltered from wind, close to the fire's warmth, how he would wake in the middle of the night to add wood to the flames so she would not get cold. There was a thoughtfulness to him that contrasted sharply with his rough exterior. One evening, she found him carving something from a piece of pine, his large hands working with surprising delicacy. When she asked what he was making, he seemed almost embarrassed. "Bird," he said, holding it up. It was a hawk, wings spread, so detailed she could make out individual feathers. "I like to keep my hands busy. It is beautiful. You are an artist. It is just whittling." "Art," she insisted. "You see the bird inside the wood. That is what artists do." He gave her a look she could not quite decipher, something warm and uncertain at the same time. Then he handed her the hawk. "For your collection, so you will remember that not everything worth knowing fits on a map." Sarah closed her fingers around the carving, feeling the smoothness of the wood still warm from his hands. "Thank you. I will treasure it." That night, lying in her bedroll under a canopy of stars so thick they looked like spilled salt, Sarah admitted to herself what had been building for weeks. She was falling in love with Matthew Garrett. It was foolish and impractical and completely undeniable. She loved the way he moved through the wilderness with such confidence, the way he spoke about the land with reverence and knowledge, the way he looked at her sometimes, as if she were a puzzle he was trying to solve, the way he made her feel safe even in the most dangerous places. But love was a luxury she could not afford, not in the middle of this expedition with so much riding on its success. So she tucked the feeling away like she tucked the wooden hawk into her satchel, something precious to be examined later when there was time. The wilderness, however, had its own timeline. They were crossing a high pass when the weather turned with the vicious speed that only mountains could conjure. One moment the sky was clear, The next they were enveloped in a storm that howled with murderous intent. Rain turned to sleet, then to heavy snow, visibility dropping to mere feet. "We have to find shelter," Matthew shouted over the wind, already turning his horse. Sarah followed, trusting him completely as he led them along what seemed like empty air but must have been a trail only he could sense. Her hands were numb on the reins, her face stinging from ice crystals driven by the gale. The mules balked, and precious minutes were lost getting them moving again. By the time Matthew found an overhang that offered protection, Sarah could barely feel her feet when she dismounted. They worked together to get the animals secured, and their gear under cover. Matthew's hands were sure despite the cold, building a fire with materials he had kept dry in waxed canvas. As flames finally caught and began to spread warmth, Sarah started shaking, the adrenaline draining away and leaving her aware of just how close they had come to disaster. "Here." Matthew wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, then pressed a tin cup of hot coffee into her hands. "Drink. You did well out there. Some people panic in storms like that." "I was too busy trying not to freeze to panic." But her attempt at humor fell flat, her voice shaking almost as much as her hands. Matthew crouched in front of her, his large frame blocking the worst of the wind that still whipped around their shelter. "You are safe now. The storm will blow itself out by morning. What if you had not found this place?" "But I did find it. I always do." There was no arrogance in his statement, just simple fact. "I will not let anything happen to you, Sarah. I promise you that." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the intimacy of it, combined with the intensity of his gaze, made something crack open in Sarah's chest. Without thinking, acting on pure instinct and need, she leaned forward and kissed him. For a heartbeat, Matthew went completely still. Then he was kissing her back, his hands coming up to cup her face with a tenderness that seemed impossible from someone so physically powerful. The kiss was warm and sure and tasted like coffee and something wild she could not name. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Sarah saw her own wonder reflected in his eyes. "I should not have done that," she whispered. "I am sorry. Don't be." His thumb traced along her cheekbone, his touch gentle. "I have been wanting to do that for weeks. I just did not think you would want someone like me. Someone like you, rough, uneducated, more comfortable with animals than people." Sarah caught his hand, holding it against her face. "You are the finest man I have ever known, Matthew Garrett. You are intelligent and kind, and you understand things that books could never teach. Do not ever think you are less than anyone." Something shifted in his expression, a vulnerability she had never seen before. "I am not good with words, not like you. But what I feel when I look at you, it is like standing on a mountaintop. Like I can see forever and everything is clear. You make me want to be part of the world again." They sat together as the storm raged outside, talking in low voices about things they had never told anyone else. Matthew spoke of growing up in the mountains of Colorado, of losing his parents to influenza when he was 16, of the years spent trapping and hunting and slowly becoming more mountain than man. Sarah told him about her mother who had died in childbirth when Sarah was 5, about learning cartography at her father's knee, about the loneliness of being a woman in a field that did not want her. "You are extraordinary," Matthew said, as the fire burned low. "The way you see the world, the way you are determined to understand it, I have never met anyone like you. I could say the same about you." He kissed her again, and this time there was a hunger to it that Sarah matched with her own. But when his hands began to wander, he pulled back, his breathing ragged. "We should stop. I do not want to dishonor you." Sarah smiled, touched by his old-fashioned sense of propriety. "Then perhaps we should discuss intentions." "Intentions?" Matthew sat back, running a hand through his hair. "I intend to finish guiding you through this survey, and then, if you will have me, I intend to court you properly. Find a preacher, make you my wife, spend the rest of my life showing you places maps can never capture." He paused. "That is, if you would want that, with someone like me." The proposal was so earnest, so utterly sincere that Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. Yes, yes to all of that. They held each other as the storm slowly died outside, and when Sarah finally slept, it was with her head on Matthew's shoulder, feeling safer than she had ever felt in her life. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the world transformed by fresh snow. They broke camp and continued their journey, but everything felt different now. Matthew would reach over to help Sarah dismount, and his hand would linger. Their fingers would brush when passing supplies, and neither would pull away. At night, they sat close by the fire, talking and kissing and planning a future that seemed to stretch as wide as the landscape around them. The work continued. Sarah filled journal after journal with observations and measurements. Matthew led her to places she would never have found alone. Hidden canyons where ancient petroglyphs marked the stones. Meadows so lush with wildflowers they looked painted. Waterfalls that fell from such heights the water turned to mist before reaching the ground. "This is what I meant," he said one afternoon, standing with her beside a crystal lake that reflected the peaks above like a mirror. "Maps can show that this lake is here, at this elevation, this size. But how do you capture the way it makes you feel? The absolute stillness of the water, the clarity so pure you can see straight to the bottom even though it is 50 feet deep." Sarah set down her surveying equipment and took his hand. "You are right. Maps cannot capture that, but what they can do is preserve knowledge. 100 years from now, someone can use my maps to find this place, and maybe they will feel what we feel now. That is worth something, is not it? When you put it like that, I suppose it is." He pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "You have changed how I see things, Sarah. Made me think that maybe people recording and knowing about these places is not all bad, if it is people like you doing the recording." They spent that night camped beside the lake, and under a moon so bright it cast shadows, Matthew asked Sarah to tell him about all the places she still wanted to map. She spoke of the Sierra Nevada, the deserts of Arizona, the northern forests. He listened intently, and then he began to describe those places as he had seen them, adding color and life to the geography she knew from reports and second-hand accounts. "We could do that together," Sarah said softly. "You guide, I map. We could see the whole West." "I would like that. I would like that more than anything." The survey took them through summer and into early fall. They mapped canyons and valleys, peaks and plateaus. Sarah's journals filled with data that would become the most comprehensive maps of the region anyone had yet produced. But more importantly, she and Matthew built a life together in the wilderness. They learned each other's rhythms, anticipating needs and moods. Matthew taught Sarah to track and hunt, to read weather in the clouds and water in the land. Sarah taught Matthew to see the bigger picture, how individual features connected to create entire systems. There were difficult moments. A bear that bluffed a charge before wandering away, leaving them both shaking. A landslide that nearly caught the pack animals, only Matthew's quick thinking saving them. Sarah developing a fever from bad water, 3 days where Matthew nursed her with a tenderness that made her love him even more. But through it all they grew closer, more certain that what they had found in each other was worth any hardship. As fall deepened, and the first serious snows began to threaten, they turned back toward Piach. The return journey was faster, following routes they now knew well. Sarah spent the travel time organizing her notes, beginning the process of turning raw observation into finished maps. Matthew rode beside her, often reaching over to touch her hand or point out some feature of the landscape he thought she would appreciate. When they finally rode into Piach on a crisp October afternoon, the town felt alien after months in the wilderness. Too loud, too crowded, too permanent. Sarah delivered her journals to Thomas Whitmore, who was astounded by the depth and quality of her work. "This is extraordinary, Miss Reeves. The government will be very pleased, and there is already interest in hiring you for additional surveys." Sarah glanced at Matthew, who stood near the door of the office, looking uncomfortable in the enclosed space. "I will need to discuss it with my partner first." "Partner?" Whitmore looked confused until he followed her gaze. "Oh, I see. Well, the offer is open whenever you are ready." They collected Matthew's payment and checked into the boarding house, taking separate rooms for propriety's sake, though they both chafed at the separation. That evening, Matthew cleaned up and changed into the only set of town clothes he owned, a suit that had seen better days but which he wore with endearing self-consciousness. Then he took Sarah to dinner at the nicest restaurant Piach had to offer. Over steak and potatoes that tasted strange after months of camp cooking, Matthew cleared his throat. "I know I said I would court you properly, but I am not much good at this town courting. Flowers and dances and all that. I do not need flowers and dances, but you deserve them. You deserve everything." He reached across the table to take her hand. "Sarah Reeves, I am asking you properly now. Will you marry me? I do not have much to offer except myself and a life that will probably involve more wilderness than civilization. But I swear I will spend every day making sure you know you are loved." Sarah's answer came without hesitation. "Yes, absolutely yes." They found a preacher the next morning, a weathered man who had seen enough of frontier life not to ask too many questions about why they wanted to marry so quickly. With Thomas Whitmore and the boarding house owner as witnesses, Sarah Reeves became Sarah Garrett in a simple ceremony that lasted all of 15 minutes. Afterward, Matthew led her to a small house on the edge of town. A cabin, really, just 2 rooms and a porch. "I bought it this morning. I know it is not much, but I thought we would need a base, somewhere to come back to between surveys." Sarah walked through the space, imagining the life they would build here. A table where she could work on her maps, a bed they would share, shelves for books and Matthew's carvings. It is perfect. That night, they consummated their marriage with a passion that had been building for months. Matthew was gentle despite his size, attentive to Sarah's every response, making sure her first time was filled with as much pleasure as possible. And later, lying tangled together in the narrow bed, Sarah traced the scars on his chest and listened to him talk about all the places he wanted to show her. There is a canyon in Arizona, walls so high and narrow that at midday the sun only hits the bottom for a few minutes. The rock is red and orange and seems to glow from within. I want to take you there. Then we will go everywhere together. The winter months they spent in Piach were a revelation. Sarah worked on converting her field notes into finished maps, painstaking work that required precision and artistry. Matthew found that he did not mind town life as much when Sarah was there to come home to. He took odd jobs, using his strength and wilderness skills to help with various tasks that needed doing. But mostly, he spent time with his wife, learning the rhythms of domestic life, discovering that happiness could exist within walls as well as under open sky. Sarah's maps were published by the territorial government to great acclaim. Suddenly, she had more work than she could handle, offers coming from mining companies, the army, private investors wanting surveys of various regions. She and Matthew discussed each one carefully, choosing projects that would take them to places Matthew knew or wanted to explore. In March of 1873, They set out on their second expedition together, this time heading south toward the deserts. The pattern they had established in the mountains continued, Sarah mapping while Matthew guided, both of them learning and growing together. When they returned months later, Sarah discovered she was pregnant. The news terrified and thrilled them both. Matthew became even more protective, worrying constantly about Sarah's health. But Sarah refused to stop working, continuing to draft maps even as her belly swelled. In January of 1874, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy they named Daniel, after her father. Holding his son for the first time, Matthew's eyes filled with tears. "I never thought I would have this. A family. A home. I thought I was meant to be alone." "You were never meant to be alone," Sarah said, exhausted but happy. "You were just waiting for the right person to find you." Motherhood changed Sarah, but it did not stop her. When Daniel was 6 months old and they had found a reliable woman in town to help with child care, Sarah and Matthew set out on another survey, this time a shorter one mapping the area around Piach in finer detail. They brought Daniel with them, the baby riding in a specially made carrier on Sarah's back. Matthew had been skeptical about bringing an infant into the wilderness, but Daniel seemed to thrive on it, gurgling happily at the birds and the wind. The years unfolded like a well-drawn map, each one marked with its own discoveries and challenges. Sarah's reputation grew until she was known throughout the West as the finest cartographer working. But she always insisted that her success was due to Matthew, that without his knowledge of the land, her maps would be hollow shells of measurement without understanding. They had 2 more children, a daughter named Margaret in 1876 and another son, Thomas, in 1879. The cabin in Piach expanded to accommodate their growing family, rooms added as needed. Matthew proved to be a devoted father, teaching the children to read signs in nature, to move quietly through the forest, to respect the land that provided for them. Sarah taught them numbers and letters, cartography, and the importance of accurate observation. Daniel showed an early aptitude for drawing, filling pages with sketches of the animals and plants he saw. Margaret was adventurous, always climbing higher and running faster than seemed safe. Thomas was quieter, thoughtful, with a gift for finding patterns in seemingly random information. As the children grew, Sarah and Matthew adjusted their survey work, taking shorter trips or bringing the children along when possible. Their cabin became a gathering place for travelers and locals interested in maps and wilderness lore. Matthew, who had once been so solitary, found himself surrounded by family and community, and to his surprise, he enjoyed it. In the summer of 1881, when Daniel was 7 and asking endless questions about how maps were made, Sarah and Matthew took all 3 children on a special trip into the Ruby Mountains. They retraced part of the route from that first survey, showing the children the places where their parents had fallen in love. Standing beside the mirror lake where Matthew had once asked about the limits of maps, Sarah watched her children throw stones into the water, their laughter echoing off the peaks. Matthew came to stand beside her, slipping an arm around her waist. "You ever regret it?" he asked. "You could have been famous in the cities, worked for universities, had a much easier life." Sarah leaned into him, solid and warm and home. "Not for a single moment. This life with you, showing our children these wild places, this is everything I ever wanted. You showed me things maps could never capture, Matthew. Love, wonder, the feeling of being exactly where you belong. No map can show that. But you tried anyway. All those journals, those sketches, you captured more than geography, you captured the spirit of these places. Because you helped me see it, we make a good team. The best." He kissed her temple. What do you say we take the children up to that waterfall tomorrow, the one that turns to mist? They will love it." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the Garrett family made camp beside the lake. Matthew told stories while Sarah drew quick sketches of the children against the mountain backdrop. Later, when the little ones were asleep in their bedrolls, Sarah and Matthew sat by the fire, holding hands and watching the stars emerge. "I have been thinking," Matthew said. "Maybe we should start training Daniel and Margaret in surveying if they are interested. Pass on what we know. Creating the next generation of map makers and guides. Why not? The West is not going to stay wild forever. But if we teach our children to understand it, to document it with respect, maybe that knowledge will help preserve something important." Sarah considered this, seeing the wisdom in it. "A family business. I like that idea." Over the next several years, that was exactly what they built. Daniel showed genuine talent for cartography, his artistic eye combining with a methodical mind to produce maps that rivaled his mother's. Margaret preferred the wilderness work, learning tracking and pathfinding from Matthew with a natural skill that made him burst with pride. Thomas, surprisingly, became interested in the scientific aspects, collecting plant and rock samples, making careful observations about geology and ecology. By 1885, the Garrett family was well known throughout Nevada and beyond. Sarah's maps had helped open new territories for settlement and mining, but they had also identified areas of unique beauty that various groups were beginning to advocate for protecting. Matthew guided hunting parties and survey teams when Sarah did not need him, but he preferred working with his wife and children, showing them the secrets of the mountains. Sarah was 35 now, Matthew 42. Their lives had settled into a comfortable rhythm, but they still felt that spark that had ignited during that storm so many years ago. Matthew would still carve things for Sarah, little wooden animals and flowers that she kept on her desk. Sarah would still read to Matthew in the evenings, sharing stories and poetry that he claimed not to understand but always listened to with rapt attention. One evening in late summer, after the children had gone to bed, Sarah showed Matthew a letter that had arrived that afternoon. It was from the Department of the Interior, requesting her expertise for a major survey of Yellowstone, the new national park. The project would take at least a year, possibly longer, and the pay was substantial. "What do you think?" she asked. Matthew read the letter carefully. "I think it sounds like an adventure. I have always wanted to see Yellowstone properly, and the children are old enough now that they could help with the work. You would not mind being away from Piotch for so long." He pulled her onto his lap, holding her close. "Piotch is just a place. You are my home, Sarah. Wherever we go together, that is where I belong." They accepted the commission, and in the spring of 1886, the entire Garrett family traveled north to Yellowstone. It was the largest project Sarah had ever undertaken, mapping not just the geography but also the thermal features, the wildlife patterns, the seasonal variations. Matthew worked closely with the park rangers, sharing his knowledge of how to move through wild country without damaging it. The children thrived, learning more in a year of field work than they could have in a decade of school. The maps Sarah produced from the Yellowstone survey became the standard for the park, used for decades. But more than that, the experience solidified the Garrett family's reputation as the people who could map wilderness while respecting its essential wildness. They were not just cartographers and guides. They were interpreters, helping others understand the language of the land. Returning to Piotch in 1887, they found the town had continued to grow and change. Some of the old-timers were gone, replaced by new faces. But the Garrett cabin on the edge of town remained a constant, now surrounded by carefully tended gardens and a workshop where Matthew did his carpentry. And Sarah taught classes in map making to anyone interested in learning. The children grew into young adults. Daniel, at 13, was already being consulted on surveying projects. Margaret, 11, could track game better than most grown men. Thomas, 8, had accumulated an impressive collection of specimens and filled journals with his observations of the natural world. Sarah and Matthew watched their children develop with a sense of accomplishment that far exceeded any professional success. As the century drew toward its close, Sarah and Matthew began to slow down, taking fewer long expeditions and spending more time close to home. But they never stopped exploring. Even a simple walk through the hills around Piach could turn into an adventure when Matthew noticed a new trail or Sarah wanted to verify some detail on one of her maps. One spring morning in 1890, on the anniversary of their wedding, Matthew took Sarah back to the ridge where he had once told her that maps could not capture how light fell at sunset. They were older now, their bodies marked by the years and the hard work, but their hands still fit together perfectly. "You remember what you said to me here?" Matthew asked as they watched the sun sink toward the horizon. "About how knowledge does not have to lead to destruction." "I remember." "You were not convinced. I am now. Because of you. You taught me that recording and understanding could come from a place of love rather than conquest. The maps you made, our children growing up respecting the wilderness, it matters." Sarah rested her head on his shoulder. "You taught me just as much, that there are things beyond measurement and notation. Feelings, experiences, moments that exist outside of time and space. We balanced each other. We still do." As the sun set, turning the Nevada landscape to gold exactly as it had nearly 2 decades before, they sat together in comfortable silence. The life they had built was not the one either of them had imagined in their youth. It was better, richer, fuller. A perfect blend of Sarah's need to document and understand and Matthew's intimate knowledge of the wild places. The years continued their steady march. The children grew up and began to make their own marks on the world. Daniel married a schoolteacher and set up his own surveying business. Margaret, to no one's surprise, became a guide like her father, one of the few women in the profession. Thomas went to college to study geology, writing frequent letters home about his discoveries. Sarah and Matthew became grandparents, welcoming Daniel's children with joy. They taught the grandchildren the same lessons they had taught their own children: respect for the land, the importance of accurate observation, the value of both knowledge and experience. In 1895, on a warm summer evening, Sarah was working on what she called her masterwork. It was a comprehensive atlas of the American West, combining decades of her own surveys with those of other cartographers, annotated with notes about the character and spirit of each region. Matthew sat beside her, carving a detailed relief map from wood to accompany her drawings. "Do you think people will understand what we were trying to do?" Sarah asked, dipping her pen in ink. "That these maps are not just about geography but about preserving something essential." Matthew looked up from his carving. "Some will, the ones who matter. And our children and grandchildren will carry it forward. We started something, Sarah. Something good." She reached over to squeeze his hand, noting the arthritis that had begun to stiffen his fingers, the gray that had taken over his dark hair. He was still strong, still capable, but time was catching up to both of them. "I love you, Matthew Garrett. You made my life an adventure, and you made mine meaningful. I love you more than I can say." The atlas was published in 1897 to critical acclaim. Sarah Garrett was hailed as one of the preeminent cartographers of the American West, her maps prized for their accuracy and artistry. But the reviews that pleased her most were the ones that mentioned how her maps seemed to capture not just the physical features of the land, but something of its spirit. Matthew framed one of those reviews and hung it in their cabin, right next to a map Sarah had drawn of the route of their first survey together, marked with little sketches of meaningful moments. That map was not in any atlas, not for sale or public consumption. It was just for them, a reminder of where their story had begun. As the new century dawned, Sarah and Matthew were in their 50s, still active but beginning to feel the full weight of the years. They took a last long expedition in the summer of 1900, just the two of them, retracing once more the paths they had walked when they were young and falling in love. They camped beside the same streams, climbed the same ridges, stood in the same valleys. Everything was familiar yet changed, the land eternal while they were ephemeral. "If I could do it all again, I would not change a thing," Sarah said one night as they lay side by side under the stars. "Every moment led to this life with you. Same for me. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Sarah. You and the life we built." They returned to Piotr that fall to find that their home had been decorated for a surprise celebration. Their children had organized a party for Sarah's 50th birthday, inviting everyone in town who had been touched by the Garrett family over the years. The cabin and yard overflowed with people, all of them sharing stories about how Sarah's maps had helped them, or how Matthew had guided them safely through dangerous country. Standing in the midst of the celebration, Sarah felt overwhelmed with gratitude. This life, this community, this love. It was more than she had ever dreamed possible on that day long ago when she had walked into the Silver Spur to proposition a reluctant mountain man. Matthew found her in the crowd, pulling her aside. "Too much, a little, but wonderful. Come with me. I have something to show you." He led her to his workshop, where he unveiled a large wooden box, beautifully carved with scenes of mountains and valleys, wildlife and weather. "For your maps and journals, everything you have created over the years, I wanted you to have a proper place to keep them." Sarah ran her fingers over the intricate carvings, tears welling in her eyes. "It is beautiful. You are still surprising me after all these years. I hope I never stop." He pulled her into his arms and they stood there in the workshop, holding each other while the party continued outside. The final years of their active life were spent close to home, but they remained engaged with the wider world. Sarah consulted on various mapping projects, her expertise sought after by government agencies and private companies. Matthew taught classes on wilderness survival and tracking. Together, they worked on preserving their knowledge, writing manuals and guides that would help future generations understand the West. In 1905, when Sarah was 55 and Matthew 62, they made the decision to officially retire from surveying. Their children threw another party, this one acknowledging the decades of work their parents had done to map and understand the frontier. Representatives from the territorial government gave speeches. Fellow cartographers and guides paid tribute. But the moment that meant the most to Sarah and Matthew was when their grandchildren presented them with a hand-drawn map showing all the places Grandma Sarah and Grandpa Matthew had explored together, decorated with little illustrations and notes about favorite memories. Retirement suited them. They spent their days puttering around the cabin and garden, taking short walks in the hills, receiving visits from children and grandchildren. Sarah organized her decades of journals and maps, creating an archive that she would eventually donate to the territorial library. Matthew carved and built things, his workshop producing furniture and artwork that family members treasured. On quiet evenings, they would sit on the porch and watch the sun set over the Nevada landscape, hands intertwined, comfortable in the silence that comes from decades of knowing someone completely. Sometimes they would reminisce about their adventures, but more often they simply enjoyed being together, needing no words to communicate what they felt. In the summer of 1910, the whole family gathered in Piach for a reunion. All three of their children came with their families, filling the cabin to bursting. There were 8 grandchildren now, ranging from toddlers to teenagers, all of them bearing some trace of Sarah's intelligence or Matthew's strength. For a week, the house rang with laughter and stories. Meals stretched long into the evening, and love seemed to saturate every moment. On the last night before everyone dispersed back to their various homes, Sarah and Matthew hosted a bonfire in the yard. As the flames leaped toward the stars, they told the story of how they met, how Sarah had propositioned Matthew in a saloon, and he had almost turned her down. The grandchildren listened with rapt attention to the tale they had heard many times before but never tired of, a love story as wild and enduring as the West itself. "So Grandpa taught you to survive in the wilderness?" the oldest grandchild asked. "He did," Sarah confirmed. "But more than that, he taught me to truly see the land, not just measure it. He showed me places maps could never capture well, places of the heart and spirit. And Grandma taught me that knowing and understanding do not diminish beauty," Matthew added. "That recording the world can be an act of love." Later, after the fire had burned to embers and the grandchildren were asleep, Sarah and Matthew took a final walk under the stars. They were both slower now, Matthew using a cane for his bad knee, Sarah's eyesight not quite what it had been. But they moved together with the ease of long partnership, supporting each other when needed. "If I go first, I need you to promise me something," Matthew said suddenly. "Don't talk like that." "Sarah, we are not young anymore. We need to speak of these things." He stopped, turning to face her. "Promise me you will not stop living, that you will keep working on your maps, spending time with the grandchildren, enjoying life. Only if you promise the same. If I go first, you cannot retreat back to the mountains and hide away from the world. I promise. Though I do not know how I would manage without you. The same way I would manage without you, by remembering every moment we shared, every adventure, every kiss, by knowing we had something rare and precious, by being grateful rather than bitter." She took his face in her hands. "We have been so lucky, Matthew. So incredibly lucky." They held each other in the darkness, 2 souls who had found each other against all odds and built a life more beautiful than either had imagined possible. The years that followed were gentle, a gradual slowing down rather than a sudden stop. Sarah continued her archival work, organizing decades of materials. Matthew's carvings became more intricate as he had more time to devote to them. They attended family gatherings, celebrated births and weddings, mourned the occasional loss. They grew old together with grace. In the spring of 1915, Sarah became ill. What started as a cough developed into pneumonia, and despite the best efforts of the doctor, she weakened rapidly. The family gathered, filling the cabin once more, but this time with worry rather than celebration. Matthew rarely left her bedside. He held her hand, read to her, told her stories about the mountains and the wild places they had explored together. On a sunny morning in April, with Matthew beside her and her children nearby, Sarah slipped away peacefully, a small smile on her face. The town of Piach turned out for her funeral, hundreds of people coming to pay respects to the woman who had mapped their territory with such skill and love. But it was Matthew's grief that struck everyone most deeply. The big mountain man who had always seemed indestructible looked diminished, hollowed out by loss. In the weeks that followed, the family worried about him. Without Sarah, Matthew seemed adrift. But he had made a promise, and Matthew Garrett kept his promises. He continued to live, finding purpose in teaching his grandchildren, in finishing projects Sarah had started, in tending the garden she had loved. He made each day a tribute to her memory. He lived another 3 years, and they were not unhappy years. He took comfort in family, in the legacy he and Sarah had built together. He carved a beautiful headstone for her grave, decorated with maps and mountains, and the words she captured the spirit of the West. And on quiet evenings, he would sit on the porch and talk to her as if she were still beside him, sharing his day and his thoughts. In the summer of 1918, Matthew Garrett died quietly in his sleep. He was 75 years old, and by all accounts, he went peacefully. The family buried him beside Sarah, their graves overlooking the Nevada landscape they had both loved so much. His headstone read, "He showed her places maps could never capture well," and below that, simply, "Together again." The Garrett children sorted through their parents' possessions, finding treasures that spoke of a deep and abiding love. Letters Sarah and Matthew had written to each other during the rare times they had been separated. The wooden hawk Matthew had carved for Sarah on their first expedition, worn smooth from decades of her carrying it as a good luck charm. Sarah's journals, filled not just with measurements but with observations about Matthew, how he moved through the wilderness, how he made her feel safe and loved. The archive Sarah had assembled was donated to the Nevada Historical Society, where it became an invaluable resource for understanding the early mapping of the West. Matthew's carvings were distributed among family members, each piece a work of art that spoke to his skill and patience. The cabin in Piotch became a family gathering place for decades, maintained by successive generations. The maps Sarah Garrett created were used well into the 20th century, prized for their accuracy. But more than that, they were appreciated for their artistry, for the way they seemed to convey something essential about the landscape beyond mere geography. Scholars who studied her work remarked that her maps had a quality that was hard to define, as if the spirit of the land itself had been captured in ink and paper. The Garrett children and grandchildren carried forward the legacy. Daniel's surveying business prospered, employing techniques his mother had pioneered. Margaret became legendary as a guide, leading expeditions into wilderness areas with her father's skill and her mother's respect for accurate documentation. Thomas's geological work contributed to the understanding of the American West's formation and resources. But perhaps the greatest legacy was something less tangible. The story of Sarah and Matthew Garrett became a sort of legend in Nevada, a tale of love found in unexpected places, of two people who complemented each other perfectly. It was told as an example of how partnership could create something greater than either person could achieve alone. How love could thrive even in the hardest conditions. How passion for work and passion for each other did not have to be separate things. On the 100th anniversary of Sarah and Matthew's wedding, their descendants gathered in Piotch for a commemoration. There were dozens of them now, spread across the West, carrying the blood and legacy of the Mapmaker and the Mountain Man. They shared stories passed down through the generations, looked at the old maps and carvings, and marveled at what their ancestors had accomplished. One of the great-great-grandchildren, a young woman who had inherited Sarah's talent for cartography, stood to speak. What Sarah and Matthew showed us is that there are different ways of knowing the world. Sarah's maps gave us objective knowledge, measurements, and locations. But Matthew's understanding gave us subjective knowledge, the feel and spirit of places. Together, they created a complete picture. That is what they gave us, and that is what we should carry forward. The understanding that knowledge and love, science and spirit do not have to be opposed. They can work together to create something beautiful. The family raised glasses in toast to Sarah and Matthew, to the love they had shared and the legacy they had built. And as the sun set over the Nevada landscape that evening, painting the world in shades of gold just as it had done on countless evenings when Sarah and Matthew had watched together, it seemed fitting. A perfect ending to a story that had been about beginnings, about two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed, and in finding it, had created something that would last long after they were gone. The maps remained, precise and beautiful, showing the contours of a West that had now largely been settled and changed. But they also showed something else if you knew how to look, something Matthew had tried to tell Sarah all those years ago. They showed the places where love had bloomed, where two people had stood together and felt something too big for words. They showed that some territories could never be fully mapped because they existed in the human heart, in the space between two people who had chosen each other against all odds and built a life of meaning and purpose. Sarah Reeves had set out to chart unknown lands. What she had found instead was Matthew Garrett, and together they had charted something far more important, a path through life that honored both the need to understand and the need to simply feel, both the desire to record and the wisdom to know that some things were beyond recording. They had shown that a mapmaker and a mountain man, seemingly opposite in every way, could create between them a perfect balance. And in the end, that was the territory they had mapped most completely. The landscape of the heart, where love grows in wild and unexpected places, where two people can find in each other a home more permanent than any town, more beautiful than any vista, more meaningful than any accomplishment. It was a map that could not be drawn on paper, but it existed nonetheless, written in the lives they had lived, the children they had raised, the legacy they had left. It was a map of love, and it would endure as long as their story was told, passed down through generations as proof that sometimes, in the vast wilderness of life, two souls find each other and create something that no map could ever fully capture.